Well, New Zealand English has been described as the sexiest English dialect there is, but it doesn't mean you're going to understand me. We're well known for not pronouncing our R's, so if you can't understand me at any point, just shout out. I'd also encourage you to shout out if you have any questions as well. I love this to be interactive. I've probably only got about 15, 20 minutes of content, so there'll be time for questions at the end. But if you want to shout out any questions along the way, that'd be great. Many of the talks today have covered what I'm going to be covering with you as well. There's a lot of common ground here, some unexpected, but there's a point in the middle of the presentation where I go a little off-piste, so it'd be interesting to get your perspective on that. And as I say, yeah, definitely shout out if you have any questions at all along the way. So, once upon a time, at every software startup, everyone was in the same room. It might be 5 people, understanding everyone knows which API is being built, everyone knows their customers, probably by name. But then things change, hopefully. You get larger customers, maybe you get customers in other geographies. Perhaps a pandemic comes along and you have to spread out a little bit. Perhaps you outsource some of your development and get a team offshore. Everywhere from New Zealand's offshore. It's just, and suddenly you just lose track of what's going on. Who built this thing? What's the name of that team? We've got, who's that tooling team? Tooler Swift? Why do they call them that? Where's Autobots? What's that team doing? Or Noki, there's a team called Noki. What on earth do they do? How am I supposed to know who owns this service and how it's developed? So we heard before about some strange names of services. At Xero, it's the strange names of teams. Our pods make no sense to me still, and I've been there for a couple of years. So if you begin tracking perhaps via a spreadsheet, we've seen some good examples of spreadsheets today, and that immediately solves the problem. Maybe you add a little bit more onto that spreadsheet. You add a few metrics about maturity of the service, its current status. Maybe you connect it through to some operational metrics as well. And people love that data. You're starting to think this might be a tool of its time. Maybe you've read team topologies and understand how important accountability and ownership actually is. So there's a lot of interest in the data. There's early attempts to integrate. Perhaps the spreadsheet is regularly ingested into your data lake or lined up with operational health metrics or figuring out whether you're doing all the patching that you should. And then someone suggested writing your own IDP. They didn't call it that, of course. This is 2019. No one knew what the name was. Perhaps it was Brian from Canada. In this case, it actually was Brian from Canada in our case. Well, he was based in Wellington at the time and has now moved back to Toronto. And very quickly, it became one of the most popular tools in the business, which is really why we're here. This has been something that's been coming for a while. We've seen it in previous companies and just seen it come to culmination in a tool such as we built at Xero. So we built a tool called Kotahi. It became very popular. There was 50-odd integrations in there, but a team of 7 running it. And that's never going to work. You've got Xero, which focuses on small business accounting. That's where its revenue comes from. Are you ever going to grow a team to meet the needs of a tool like this? So this is a talk about that, how we moved away from our IDP, how we moved towards eventually choosing Cortex, and what that's done for us and what we expect from it in the future. But first, a little about New Zealand. Who can spot New Zealand on the map? Well, it should be on the map, but the Europeans, in their great wisdom, decided to put Europe at the centre of the known universe. And New Zealand often falls off the edge. There was, in fact, our Prime Minister at the time, Jacinda Ardern, did a nice presentation with Rhys Darby of Flight of the Conchords fame. Anyone know Flight of the Conchords? Yeah, that's just New Zealand completely. It's insane. Yeah. There's a whole tourist encouragement going up to talking about why is New Zealand off the map. And you can see it, that's the IKEA map at the top there. But even the flat earthers forgot about us. You can see we're not even on that. So Mercator maps have a lot to answer for. New Zealand is a little bigger than you think. Surface area about the same as Colorado. There is a point to me explaining all of this, by the way. Its population about the size of Louisiana, but the jazz isn't as good. There's 6 sheep to every human. There was 12, so I think Wales is still ahead of us there. We're at 6 sheep, and it does shake a lot. Being on the Pacific Rim, there's The geography is not so different to Japan, similar sort of size, very mountainous, a lot of it forged by tectonic plate boundaries. In fact, Auckland, our largest city, has 50 dormant volcanoes around it. Who would put a city there, really? All of which really says that as a country, we're probably about as insecure as Canada. It's something about having a large, noisy neighbour, I think. What would that be? Yeah. But there's a few things to remember New Zealand by. Ernest Rutherford, America's Cup. It was nice to see the reference to that earlier. Now that we've won it 3 times in a row, I think we should rename it. Mentioned Flight of the Conchords. Lord of the Rings, of course, I have to mention Lord of the Rings. I spoke to someone earlier who was mentioning a family member going to Hobbiton. Yep, that's still there. It was probably the biggest tourist attraction. And it was basically a 9-hour tourist video for New Zealand, that one. Apart from the waterfall that Boromir goes over. Apparently it's South America. We don't have big enough waterfalls. I mentioned the 50 dormant volcanoes around our largest city, and no point more than 75 miles from the ocean. You'll see our neighbour there, the West Island. That's where we keep all the snakes and poisonous spiders and deserts and things like that. And New Zealanders' view of the world there on the left as well. Right, a little about me. I'm a head of engineering at Xero. I've been there for about 2 years now. Xero is founded in 2006. To a lot of companies around that time were talking 2.0s, and this was accounting 2.0. What's the cloud version of accounting, which really hadn't been done before that time. So over the next 20 years, really, or 18 years, it's been dominating the market in New Zealand. It's very hard to go talk to a small business in New Zealand that's not using Xero. Similarly in Australia, it's growing in the UK. There's some big players, very great players in the US that makes it a little bit complicated here. Also the fact that every state has different tax rules, which makes it really, really difficult. So partnerships become really, really important as well to meet those needs. It's like every other startup, two guys in a garage. And it was only recently that our founder, Rod Drury, moved on to other things. Really, I think a really nice home near Wanaka in the South Island. It's a beautiful part of the world. As I say, the area I'm responsible for at Xero is called Engineering X. It's had lots of names through its time at Xero. We've always thought about these things, productivity engineering, DevX, engineering practice. In this case, it's Engineering X. So we cover a range of things, the golden path side of things. How do you take what you know and take it to other teams who don't necessarily want it? You first discover where their biggest challenges are. You go and meet them, you help them with those challenges, and in the process you learn about what needs to be standardized and what doesn't, and you can start to move that out horizontally. So you try to find that win-win, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. As for me, I tried really hard to be a musician, but I turned out I was a bit too lazy, and the life of a musician is very difficult. The rest of my family are musicians. My wife's a violinist, my children all learn violin, they're all studying to be musicians, so I suspect I'll be supporting them for the rest of their lives. Right, moving on. I don't think that'll work. That probably came from my previous deck before I got merged in here, but it might work. If you want to scan that, it may well get you to the slides, or it might get blocked by Xero's firewall. We'll see. Okay, number 8, wire. Who's heard of that as a term? Number 8, wire mentality. Why number 7 and why not number 9? I mean, I don't know that part. But the number 8 wire mentality really comes into why I introduced you to a little bit about New Zealand. It's 2,000 kilometres, or 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass. You've got Australia off to the left there. It's right in the middle of the Pacific. It's got probably 5 million people across an area the size of the United Kingdom, when you've got 19 million people all within close proximity here. All of which means that, it wasn't always 5 million people. At one point it was 1 million people. So when you're solving problems, you solve it with what you have at your disposal. And being originally, as much as anything, a farming primary producer nation, it's the number 8 fencing wire. So that's the mentality that we have. There's a reason why probably the country in the world that loved MacGyver the most in the 1980s was New Zealand. That's the way we roll. Yeah, it's a rugged landscape. It's forged by earthquakes and volcanoes. So that isolation leads to a DIY mentality. Since I've been in New York, I've spoken to so many people who have really interesting ways to solve some of the problems that we have. But despite modern technology, despite Zoom and other ways of doing things, it's still a tendency to build first before you think of buying. In the case of an IDP, that was probably the right call in 2019. There was early thoughts on that. I guess Spotify at that point was thinking about open sourcing Backstage, but it was still early days. We needed to, so we chose to build our own. But that can also be a problem. If your natural inclination is to build first, you're going to have a lot of these things to manage. And as I mentioned on the next slide, that's quite a challenge. And one of the reasons, I mentioned Ernest Rutherford before, founder of modern nuclear physics, really, but also the greatest experimentalist since Faraday. So there's a lot of that thinking, and it's why the New Zealand America's Cups boats are so successful. The first one, while they didn't win the competition at the time, they came in a fiberglass boat with a wing keel. So they were always willing to try different ideas. And frequently, American venture capital buys them. So many startups in New Zealand, but before too long, not many of them get big like Xero has. We have something like 4,500 people around the world, of which 1,500 are engineers. Across product and technology, I suspect there's about 2,500 people. But it's still, if you look across Xero, you see a lot of variety in the technology in use, a lot of tools that have been brought in, but also a lot that were built for ourselves. And the internal developer portal was one of those. Now, I haven't left any space to breathe. If you have any questions so far, just fire away. Otherwise, we can wait till the end. Stunned silence. That's good. The problem with this is that these teams are never resourced well enough. So what did I put here? Internal teams that build systems to meet key needs outside core revenue drivers cannot keep up with demand. You might think you can. So in our case, with our internal developer portal, Kotahi, it was really popular. A lot of integrations were built by other teams. But inevitably, there's going to be a reorg, and someone's going to have the bright idea and say, why don't we get that central team to own all these integrations? And suddenly, you're stuck. There's nothing more you can do. You've got these 50 integrations to look after, some of them all built with different technologies in different ways. You don't understand what they're all used for. And before long, you've got that 50-year roadmap that you can never hope to move on from. So here's the story of how that happened at Kotahi, at Xero, and how we moved on from that. So we did start well ahead of the curve. There was, again, I feel that's a very New Zealand thing. But in the park, and with all the players in this market now, it really shows that the need was real. We've got it's such an open space now. And when we came to the conclusion that we could no longer build our own, there were so many opportunities. We looked at a variety of SaaS offerings, we looked at open source offerings, but what we most wanted from, and I'll cover this a little bit later, why we made this call, was to be able to free up the people to work on things that most related to the revenue of the business. So whatever we were going to do was going to need to reduce the number of people working on this internal developer portal. We did compare a number of options. We didn't rule out going open source. Certainly that was the preferred option from engineers who are very familiar with what they were doing. But when you're bringing business thinking into that, it really made a difference. So when you come to make that choice, and we did take a year over it, we did try a lot of options, we did even consider, first of all, you're enticed by all the magic numbers that tell you how productive you're going to be when you bring in a tool like this. And we chose to ignore that as far as possible and consider, does it financially make sense? And that's at a point in time I would have loved to have a tool like Aptio or Yarkin or something like that that could tell me these things, but we used a spreadsheet. And mostly that went well, except for when I confused New Zealand dollars for US dollars. It made quite a difference. But either way, it stacked up that if we took all the costs of a team working on this, all the tools we would no longer need to look after and the capitalization benefits of that, and if we considered all the other teams that were slowed down by the fact that we couldn't go fast enough, it stacked up before we even started considering the magical numbers that get you stuck in the Gartner hype curve. So that was key to us. That made the conversation flow. But, so now we knew it stacked up to move away from our internal system. We knew it stacked up to be able to go SaaS. We hadn't completely confirmed that. But that's where we moved on to what matters most to us. And some of this was thinking at the time, and some of which has evolved ever since then. So who's come across Gregor Hoppe's concept of floating platforms?
I have a question.
Great.
Yeah. So if you go back to the last slide we were talking about the analysis you did about you were losing throughput supporting your internal IDP versus what you could be working on. Who brought that up? Was that from like the bottom up from engineers, or was that a management call?
It was a middle management call, really. It wasn't coming through from high-level management who tended to set the scene and set the direction. It might come up in operational review meetings, and we'd get a sense, oh, there's a bit of a challenge there. But it was really middle management is feeling the crunch and the pain of not being able to meet the needs of the teams because it had become such a popular tool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. So I was just asking, as I did before here, did I go the wrong way? Okay, let's try that again. That's better. Who's come across Gregor Hope's concept of floating platforms? Hey, thanks, Justin. There's one of you. At a talk a couple of years ago, and I'll come on to this shortly, the idea, how do you centralize your expertise but allow your innovation to flourish? So with a floating platform, you've got this, as little friction as possible, with as much transparency as possible. You have a platform at your core that you base most of your innovation on. We see that with AWS. You think about it that way. You don't think about AWS for its user interface. You think about it for the capability that it provides. But over time, the capability of something like AWS grows. So what do you do then? You've probably built some of that yourself. Do you keep that, or that duplication, or do you deprecate what you have done so you can build further innovation? And what I'm going to talk about shortly is how I'd argue that a tool like Cortex with its plugin model can serve as that concept of a floating platform. Platform teams at Xero, and I'm sure at other places, struggle with the whole centralized versus decentralized concept. Mandates often don't work. There'll be a moment in time when executive leadership say, we need to focus on this, this is vital. But going back to that Lord of the Rings analogy earlier, it's like having the Eye of Sauron. You have that moment where there's extreme attention, but that attention will move. You only have it for so long, and you need to, and other things that come up that need attention. I've even found that as I've gone further in my management career. I like to think I can be across everything, but I'm doing exactly what every manager has done to me before. You focus on something intently for a bit till you think it's under control, and then you move on. But as mentioned before, engineering excellence is never under control. It's constantly evolving. The other anti-pattern I've seen is platform teams who build what they think the business needs, who do a really great job of it, who are let loose to build these wonderful things that the product engineering teams in the end don't want. They are stuck in their own issues, their capacity. If you're bringing something to them where they need to do a significant change, it's really hard to fit it in. How do you go about that? So what I've found does work is the idea of a frictionless, logical platform that combines services, I'll get my word, that's not English, combines services, enablement of key jobs to be done, and the education. So it's not just about the tools and handing them over. It's about finding the problems that these engineering teams need, the ones that are most important to them and to the business, taking your enablement capability to them, and learning about how you can help them vertically so that you can take what you're learning to become more standard across the business. So an API-first strategy is a great example of that. If the business decides that it wants its APIs to be more standardized, you go to the teams that have the biggest deficit in that area, you support them, you help them get there, but in the end, you're getting the hardest area to be your early adopter that helps you then scale it further across the business. So how does an IDP fit into this meta concept? By being an ecosystem or a logical platform of tools, plugins, integrations, and workflows. And I'll have an example shortly of how I think this might tie all together. Again, not particularly revolutionary. There's been mentions of this earlier today. Justin talked about it at one point. So I mentioned floating platforms, the idea that you centralize the expertise so you can build the innovation on top. As you can see from the picture here, low friction. If it's not low friction, then the engineers will work around it. It's like an ant colony type optimization. It will take the shortest path. If you haven't got a platform that's low friction, that's highly transparent so that you can get contributions to it, and that you have that sense of shared responsibility, we're all in this together and we own it, then it's really, really difficult to get the adoption you need. So on top of that, you can see the blue blocks, the ideas of innovation. And again, this is not my slide. This is what Gregor presented a couple of years ago. In many cases, like AWS, it's all the platforms, all the different technologies you can build, and then you integrate with them in your own way. With something like Cortex or Backstage, you have plugins. So that allows you to create your innovation relatively constrained, which makes it a bit easier, but it creates more of an ecosystem concept. So what happens in this platform? So the idea of this platform, it's this intrinsic capability that allows you to grow adoption of that platform. So if you're struggling to get eventing happening in your engineering team, then perhaps try a transactional outbox pattern against your databases. If your eventing platform then finally provides this natively, perhaps you can remove the duplication so that it's only done once and you can build further innovation on top of that. And Cortex has workflows to simplify and standardize engineering's jobs to be done. We have one example at Xero we call accelerators. If you were going to build an API from scratch and try and do it in a compliant way and get full end-to-end, it could end up taking weeks with the infrastructure involved, the identity work involved, the security work involved. But with a templating tool that takes you through those jobs to be done to get to the and ultimately produce API, you can do that within a day. All started from Cortex as that center point for your jobs to be done. And for example, if you were going to build another layer on top of your mail tool, you might have your own spam detection in place there, but if the mail tool then evolves that as well, you can take that away and start building those further innovations on top. But number one here is that lack of friction, and that's followed by shared responsibility and self-service. Platform teams can't and really shouldn't scale linearly. I've struggled with that word before, linearly with the business. So like any 15-plus-year-old company, you're likely to have many deployment methods. Handily, Xero has a tool at the heart of this, and being a country that named its islands North Island and South Island, we call it deploy track. So it's relatively straightforward. We name our tools well. We name our teams strangely. So it's the heart of most of our deployment methods. We'll probably have 70% of our deployments going through this deploy tracking mechanism. And then, of course, there's a lot of reporting on the other side of that. We're talking a bit later around industries that are heavily regulated. Xero is naturally as being responsible for many small businesses accounting. So having some kind of standards in place or understanding of your deployments is crucial for SOC 2 and ISO compliance. So you stick your IDP in there, and you suddenly have a powerful method for ensuring that only tools meeting agreed standards can pass through your gate. And that's been talked about a number of times. So imagine this. A team sets off a deployment. It goes through your deployment tracking mechanism. Deploy track checks Cortex using a universal ID that you have all the way through. Does this team have the right to deploy? Have they been deploying safely recently so don't have to have that manually checked? Great. They've got exemption from any kind of customer or sort of checking process. All right, now let's go through the scorecard that has all the most important automated checks for the business. Great, they pass all of this. They haven't. SonarQube says that their unit test coverage hasn't dropped. And there's a bunch of other things that it's looking at to make sure that you meet everything you need to allow deployment to go through. And then you have a choice. You either notify teams if they're attempting to deploy, but they haven't met all the standards, or if you're in a time of great scrutiny, then you might block that as well. And all of that then, so you've got that system of the execution system, but then out of all that, there's an incredible range of metrics. How are teams going on their own? What are the analytics telling you that this process or these particular things that are important in your path to production, does that actually make a difference? Is your uptime higher? Are you having less failure? Is your change failure rate lower? Is your mean time to recovery better? So floating platforms as the center of this, so thinking of something like Cortex with its plugin model, with all its integrations inwards and outwards, at the center of an ecosystem is a wonderful way to conceptualize an IDP. And at one point there, it felt to me that the UI was the most important part of all of this, the dashboard, the ability for a manager to come in and see the view they need to see. But really it comes down to avoid dashboards require people to go and look at them. And that's just a variation on what we used to have, where these path to production standards was something a team went through and progressively checked off to make sure they were on track. It was manually done. We go along to an operational health meeting every month or so, a very lagging indicator. But a dashboard is somewhat a lagging indicator as well, when you could be managing by exception and automation. Any questions so far? Great. So, getting towards the end now. I'm not sure how long I've been talking for, Justin.
You got another 5 minutes, you're good.
Great, thank you. So what happens when you decide, I'm going to move away from build and I'm going to buy a lot of these tools? You think all your problems are solved. You're taking away all these things that have been difficult for internal teams. But let's say you move to something like Launch Darkly, 1,500 developers going on to Launch Darkly because feature flags are vital, and you've been trying to do this system of your own that's been difficult to maintain. There's a lot of best practices involved with feature flagging to make sure you avoid production incidents in the future. They need to make sure they look after the life cycle. And then if you've got a bunch of these tools, who's going to look after all the vendor management? Renewals come up. You might look after it might be a 3-year deal, but if you've got 50 of these tools and 15 of them fall with one team, perhaps your quality enablement team that's looking after Packflow and a bunch of other things, maybe looking after Postman, it becomes really difficult. So you need to consider the impact. We had, and this is no fault of Cortex at all, this is because we had a long history of having an internal developer portal. When we moved to Cortex, within a month, we were showing data we were really happy with. It was a read-only version. We were taking it through our own portal first, where people were still working, but we could visualize it in Cortex. But if you build your own internal developer portal, you build it to match your data's idiosyncrasies. For example, our lowest team structure is the pod. If you've got 7 people in a pod, it could well be that 2 or 3 of them are reporting through a different org hierarchy. Now, if you've got your own tool, you can manage that and make sure the right general manager, and in New Zealand terms, a VP here, is doing their operational health reporting a little bit later on. But if you don't have a tool with that in mind, then you're going to have things appear for the same VP in a couple of places. It makes this reporting really, really difficult. So when you've got 50 integrations all suffering from this problem, it can take a long time to work it through. So 1 month to be really happy with what we're seeing in Cortex, 6 months to convince all the teams that they needed to move these integrations to better fit what the world looks like. So our data is in a much better shape as a result. We understand it better, our integrations are all better, but don't underestimate the challenge. It's almost the inverse of a team who's not had this concept at all before. It could take you a long time to get to the point that everything's got the right owner, it's all looking good. Right, nearly done. I guess the last thing I'd say on this, when you've got a large number of tools, and going back to how I originally spoke about all the things that you currently own and may have been in a spreadsheet, now you have that. It's just a little bit different. You've got a bunch of SaaS tools that you're looking after. You've moved away from the build all the time, and you've got a bunch of tools that you've bought. You need to understand their maturity. You need to have a front door process to make sure they go to the right teams to be managed, and you need to make sure that you understand the life cycle of those tools as well. So it all comes back again, just in a slightly different way. So right, thank you all very much. And if there's any questions at all?
You had a slide that basically said, okay, we did this. It freed up the team, theoretically. Maybe it did. What did they do? Like from an engineering leader perspective, what did they now do that was moving the business better, faster, more securely, or whatever? Or did they just have more time to, I don't know, look at Instagram?
So the team that was looking after our internal developer portal, what do they do now? So they're spread around a number of teams. There's some working more closely to our gateway. We're trying to we've got about 5 or 6 different gateways at the moment. We're trying to boil that down to one. We've got a team that's working on our accelerators. We're trying to make, at the moment, that's great for building brand new APIs, but how do you use them to move away from your giant monoliths? Maybe you understand your domain, you can use your gateway to set up your domain, and perhaps you'll put accelerators between that and your monoliths so you can start to gradually siphon off the code. So there's lots of other things that they've been let off the leash to do as well, and now that's a much smaller team. They still a little bit of focus on Cortex at the moment. It's reducing, which is really great, and now they're focusing more on that deploy track tool I mentioned before. How do you intercept deployments and get the right checks in place to make sure that a release is allowed to go through?
Yep. So in relation to that deploy gate and even new services, how do you think about accelerating, kind of getting into, I guess, compliance for lack of a better term? So somebody hits the deploy gate, they have some things that are not meeting the standards. What are you all at Xero doing to make it easier for them to meet those standards?
With the level of automation we're aiming for, it'll mean that developers can get that information about how they're going, when they make their commits, ideally, rather than waiting all the way, okay, we're ready for a deployment. If it's an entirely manual process where people are going, is this ready for release? Have they done all of this? Then it becomes an anti-pattern. You have fewer deployments, they become bigger deployments. It actually causes more problems than you had. But with the automation in place, we can feed that through, get information about where there's trouble. We can make a decision whether to let a certain amount through while we're developing maturity in the area. But in the end, you're wanting to grow a culture that this is really important. Every engineer knows about it. These are standard things, hygiene things we expect as a business. If we want to, if we're wanting to go faster, the faster you go with shaky foundations, the more problems you're going to have.
Thank you.